There is a foundational pattern of thought that quietly reconfigures the way you experience reality. It doesn't begin on the surface, not with repeated affirmations, not with motivational slogans, not with trying to force your mind into positivity. It starts much deeper, in the interior layers of your psyche, in the very place that determines whether you are shaped by the world around you or whether you generate your experience from the core of your being. Can you sense the difference? Can you feel the unmistakable energetic contrast between someone who is constantly chasing approval and someone who simply exists in their fullness, drawing others toward them without effort? This quality, this unmistakable presence, has a name in depth psychology. It doesn't only influence how people perceive you, it dictates what kinds of situations and relationships can even approach your life. In the minutes ahead, you will understand the exact reason why some individuals naturally magnetize respect, meaningful relationships, and unforeseen opportunities, while others pour themselves out endlessly, exhaust their energy, and remain unseen. This isn't about strategies or surface-level social techniques. This is about a profound internal restructuring of your psychic foundation. Carl Jung identified this as the decisive line between a fragile, inflated ego and a genuinely integrated self. The contrast is invisible from the outside, yet its impact radiates like a magnetic field. What you are learning here is not a simple mindset shift. It is a complete recalibration of your internal operating system. You will come to understand what it means to think from a queen's center, an internal orientation that has nothing to do with pretending to be royal, and everything to do with embodying a sovereign psychological stance. And this single shift opens the very pathways that once felt inaccessible. Picture your mind as an energetic blueprint. Every core belief, every unexamined shadow, every piece of suppressed emotion emits a distinct frequency. Most people think they can change their lives by forcing a single positive thought. But that is the equivalent of painting over a house whose foundation is crumbling underneath. The true transformation comes not from isolated thoughts, but from the inner structure those thoughts emerge from. Jung recognized that your internal arrangement determines whether you move through life as someone asking for permission or as someone who naturally commands their reality. A queen doesn't wonder whether she's allowed to enter. Her very presence defines the room. The environment orients itself around her. And none of this has anything to do with ego or arrogance. It is rooted in deep internal alignment. When your ego is no longer battling your shadow, when you stop hiding or exiling parts of yourself, your energy stops scattering into 1,000 directions. You become unified. And this unification generates a field that others can sense before you speak. They recognize that you are not auditioning for approval. They sense you are not performing or reaching outward for validation. And paradoxically, it is this absence of seeking that draws in the very acknowledgement and respect so many people chase but never receive. So many of us move through life carrying an invisible internal script, what Jung called a complex. A complex acts like a small, autonomous entity within the psyche. It hijacks your responses before you even know what's happening. The good girl or orphan complex is especially common. It forms in childhood when you learn that being fully yourself is risky, that shining too brightly invites judgment, and that shrinking seems safer. This complex whispers, wait to speak until everyone else approves. It urges you to apologize for taking up space. It suggests you should feel grateful just to be acknowledged. The voice is subtle, but it shapes your entire perceptual framework. When you operate from that complex, you are forever standing outside the doorway of your own life, waiting for someone else to let you in. But no one is coming to offer that permission. No external authority can grant it. The only person who can open that door is you. A queen reverses the flow completely. She asks only one question first. Does this resonate with my deepest truth? That single reversal transforms every interaction around you. It is not selfishness. It is energetic integrity. When you stop filling a room with the static of apology and subconscious submission, you give others tacit permission to inhabit their own power. You become a mirror of sovereignty rather than a reflection of need, and by doing so, You naturally attract a different quality of people and circumstances, those that match your inner coherence. How you see yourself in your own mind becomes the template for how the world responds to you. If your mental narrative is built on the need to prove your worth, you turn yourself into an object to be evaluated. You hand your power to every opinion, every glance, every passing judgment. Jung described individuation as the movement from object to subject, from being defined by others to defining your own reality, from reacting to acting, from waiting for approval to embodying truth. This shift begins with one profound choice: to stop seeing yourself through borrowed eyes. A queen maintains her own gaze, even when faced with rejection. She knows rejection is not an indictment of her essence, but a reflection of incompatible frequency, and she allows that mismatch to be simply that, a difference, not a wound. When you remain anchored within yourself, external projections lose their ability to penetrate. They fall away because there is nothing inside you for them to latch onto. This is the turning point. You stop drawing in what aligns with fear and begin drawing in what matches your internal sovereignty. Something elemental shifts. You stop thinking from scarcity and begin thinking from presence. Presence doesn't ask, "What if they don't accept me?" Presence simply says, "I am here." And that simple, grounded existence is transformative precisely because it seeks nothing. Jung introduced the idea of the transcendent function, the psyche's inherent capacity to merge what seem like opposing forces into a unified whole. Most people spend their lives torn between extremes, believing they must pick a single identity or mode of being. They think they can either be strong or gentle, independent or connected, assertive or receptive. But the sovereign mind doesn't fracture itself this way. It knows that real strength emerges from holding both sides without collapsing into either. Power is found in integration, not in imbalance. This way of thinking isn't strictly intellectual or emotional. It is symbolic, intuitive, and holistic. It moves through union rather than division. And once you stop labeling pieces of yourself as acceptable or unacceptable, once you stop splitting your psyche into preferred and rejected parts, your energy returns to you. You become a single, coherent entity instead of a collection of warring fragments. People feel this difference. They sense when someone is internally aligned. They sense when the noise inside you has quieted. Your presence feels steady. And in your steadiness, others find clarity because you are no longer transmitting mixed signals. Instead of being a battlefield of competing impulses, you become an integrated landscape. From this integration, your external experience naturally reorganizes. You stop drawing in turmoil because the turmoil inside you has dissolved. You stop encountering people who feed on insecurity because you no longer broadcast insecurity. Without meaning to, you begin attracting only what resonates with your completeness. This is the essence of magnetic thinking. It arises not from force or performance, but from ending the internal conflict that bleeds your energy away. You've seen this energy in certain people before. The ones who enter a room and change its entire atmosphere without raising their voice, without demanding attention, without performing. They exude a calm that feels both grounding and unmistakably powerful. You might assume they were born that way, but this quality is rarely innate. It is cultivated. It is the natural result of someone who has confronted their shadows, integrated the parts of themselves they once disowned, and made peace with their own contradictions. Because they are no longer fighting themselves, they have no need to fight the world. Their presence becomes its own form of communication. You can develop this same presence by starting with simple awareness. Notice the exact moment you begin justifying yourself. Notice when you shrink or soften your truth to avoid discomfort. Notice when you mentally ask the world for permission to exist. In those moments, pause and ask yourself a new question. What if I didn't have to do that? This small interruption opens a pathway to a completely different way of thinking. A way rooted not in scarcity, but in sufficiency. Not in fear, but in trust. Not in performing, but in being. A queen never argues for her worth. She lives it quietly. Her certainty is not loud, it is steady. Jung once said that the true self cannot be explained to another person's ego. It can only be recognized by someone who is also awake. This means not everyone will understand you once you stabilize in your truth. And that is perfectly natural. Understanding is never a prerequisite for respect. Authentic presence carries its own authority. It doesn't grasp, it doesn't beg, it doesn't chase. It simply is. And in its simplicity, it becomes magnetically compelling. Most people spend their lives pursuing an external crown, chasing approval, status, accomplishments, or love, under the belief that worthiness can be acquired like a possession. They assume that if they accumulate enough achievements or please enough people, they will eventually feel whole. But this pursuit always fails because it is built on the false idea that wholeness comes from the outside. Jung rejected this entirely. Individuation, in his view, is not about constructing a self, but revealing the one that has always been there. Your sovereignty is not something you build, it is something you uncover. It has existed beneath years of conditioning, fear, and social expectation. And the journey of returning to yourself is not about becoming more. It is about remembering what was always yours. Before the world taught you to dim your light, before you learned to shrink, before you absorbed messages about who you were supposed to be, there was an unfiltered, unshaken version of you. That is your inner queen. She has been waiting for you to recognize her again. When you begin thinking from this remembered self, your life shifts. Not because the world suddenly turns friendly, but because you finally stop abandoning yourself. You no longer rely on external approval to feel complete. You stop seeking what you already possess. Your foundation becomes internal rather than external, and the weight of striving falls away. This is not escapism. It is the end of internal warfare. The world no longer needs to reflect your fragmentation because the fragmentation within you has healed. From here, you start attracting from alignment instead of fear, not from anxiety or scarcity, but from truth. You follow what resonates, and you release what doesn't. And you do it without the guilt or hesitation that once held you hostage. The Queen's mind is not driven by calculation, but by resonance. It does not ask, what do I need to do to get what I want? It asks, what is true for me? This question opens pathways that the strategic mind cannot see, because when you act from truth, you move with the current of life instead of against it. Jung described this as synchronicity, the meaningful interplay between inner alignment and outer reality. When your inner world is coherent, the outer world begins to align with it, not through magic, but through the natural resonance of wholeness. A queen's inner signal is sovereignty, and life responds with reflections of that sovereignty. This does not remove hardship. It changes how hardship is met. You stop collapsing when things go wrong because your center is no longer dependent on circumstances. You become the anchor others seek, not by forcing stability, but by embodying it. This is the quiet power that draws people near. In a world full of noise, internal steadiness is irresistible. Shadow integration is one of Jung's most essential steps toward individuation, and it reshapes the way you relate to your own power. Your shadows are never the enemy. They are the parts of you that were pushed into the dark because someone once told you they were unacceptable. These disowned aspects don't disappear. They wait. They follow you silently, influencing your choices, draining your energy, demanding to be acknowledged. The moment you finally turn toward them, something remarkable happens. They stop overpowering you and begin supporting you. They become sources of vitality rather than sources of fear. Think of how much of your life has been spent managing or suppressing parts of yourself that felt dangerous or risky. Perhaps you hid your anger because anger once triggered punishment. Maybe you buried your ambition because someone convinced you it was unfeminine or selfish. Perhaps your sensitivity was mocked, so you learned to numb it. Or maybe your intensity, creativity, or sexuality frightened people who preferred you muted. Every suppressed part required constant psychic effort to keep contained. Imagine how much energy has been diverted into this lifelong act of self-restriction. Now imagine reclaiming all of that energy simply by allowing those parts to exist. Not by acting them out recklessly, but by letting them be seen, by understanding their purpose, by giving them a place at the table. That reclaimed energy becomes strength, it becomes clarity, it becomes capacity. This is the difference between someone afraid of their own power and someone who can wield their power with wisdom. A true sovereign doesn't fear her inner fire. She knows it is part of her. She knows she can be soft without losing strength, powerful without losing compassion, tender without losing boundaries. She refuses to be confined to a single role. She embodies her full spectrum, and because of this inner breadth, her outer world changes. She no longer attracts people who only desire fragments of her. She begins drawing in those who can meet her whole, who respect all the dimensions she carries. Life itself becomes richer in her presence, not because circumstances magically improve, but because she is no longer shrinking into a fraction of herself. She isn't leaking energy into self-denial. Jung called this center of fullness the self, the psychological core where every part belongs and no part is denied. When you inhabit this center, external validation loses its grip. You stop needing approval to feel grounded. You stop rearranging yourself to avoid rejection. You stop chasing what you already possess within. You become self-contained, not isolated, but inwardly anchored. You move from reaction to intention. You act rather than compensate. You speak from clarity rather than fear. This is the essence of a sovereign consciousness. You become your own authority, quietly, steadily, without posturing. Not stubborn, but rooted. Not closed, but discerning. This clarity is what others feel. It's why people are drawn to it. It cuts through confusion like a lighthouse in dark water. Those who are also searching for themselves sense your steadiness and gravitate toward it. Your presence reminds them of something they too have forgotten. You become a living invitation, not to follow you, but to remember themselves. This is the deeper service of the inner queen. She doesn't rescue, she doesn't force, she doesn't mold others into her image. Instead, she stands fully in her own truth so that others are free to find theirs. People learn more from your presence than your persuasion. They awaken because they sense your alignment, not because you demand it. A sovereign woman respects her boundaries as much as she respects the boundaries of others. She doesn't collapse into caretaking, nor does she dominate. She knows when to step close and when to step back. She understands that each person must walk their own psychological path and that love never requires taking someone's journey for them. Love becomes spacious, supportive, and strong. It speaks honestly without wounding, and it gives generously without emptying itself. When your love comes from inner fullness instead of insufficiency, it becomes restorative rather than draining. It uplifts without controlling, empowers without rescuing, and invites without forcing. This is love that does not imprison or sacrifice itself. It sustains. And from this place of depth, your life begins to realign. Opportunities unfold. People who match your frequency appear. You start noticing synchronicities that guide you forward. Not because you're forcing outcomes, but because you are finally in harmony with your own essence. A queen does not wait for perfect timing. She creates stability wherever she stands. Her sovereignty does not depend on circumstances, but radiates from within. She can sit in a palace or a one-bedroom apartment and carry the same authority because her power is not external. It is an internal posture, a state of consciousness. And that posture is available to you right now. You don't need to wait until you have healed every wound or answered every question. The queen within you is not a future version, waiting at the end of some imaginary timeline. She is the part of you that has been silently intact all along. She is the voice that has whispered truth every time you doubted yourself. She is the presence that survived every disappointment. She is the essence that cannot be broken. When you begin thinking from her center, your entire reality shifts. You stop attracting from emptiness and start attracting from wholeness. You stop tolerating what insults your soul. You stop holding on to people who cannot meet you. And without bitterness or drama, you simply align with what matches your truth. Because now you can finally feel the difference between what resonates and what drains. When you live from this remembering, the world begins to respond. People treat you differently because they can sense you treat yourself differently. Situations unfold with greater ease because you are no longer split within. Your decisions sharpen, your boundaries strengthen, your path becomes clearer. This is not ego. This is coherence. And coherence is magnetic. Not everyone will hear your music, and not everyone is meant to. A sovereign being is not defined by universal approval, but by the steadiness of her own inner alignment. She doesn't twist herself into shapes to be understood. She doesn't dilute her truth to avoid unsettling others. When your thoughts and actions rise from the center of your being, rather than from fear, you stop negotiating for acceptance. You stop fighting to justify your existence. You stop bending toward opinions that were never meant to shape you. This is the shift from external orientation to internal authority, a shift Jung regarded as one of the most decisive turning points in psychological development. When your mind is rooted in the self, rather than the ego's fragile defenses, reactivity fades. You stop interpreting rejection as evidence of inadequacy. You begin to see it for what it is, an energetic mismatch, a simple misalignment between frequencies. Nothing personal, nothing catastrophic, just clarity. This clarity disarms the hooks that used to pull you into self-doubt. Criticism lands differently because it no longer has a place to latch onto. You aren't trying to fit into someone else's narrative about who you should be. You remain anchored in the truth of who you already are. This inner anchoring is what shifts your reality. Suddenly you're not available for what once drained you. You don't chase the people who withhold affection. You don't cling to situations that erode your dignity. You don't entertain dynamics that echo your old wounds. You respond as someone who knows her own value, not as someone hoping to be chosen. This is the moment your inner frequency changes and the world around you begins to rearrange itself. Attraction no longer moves along the lines of fear or scarcity. Instead, it follows the lines of presence and coherence. You meet life with a calm certainty that requires no explanation. A person who has reached this level of internal order no longer participates in the exhausting cycles of proving, performing, or pleading. They simply show up. Their presence speaks for them. Their silence carries authority because it arises from wholeness, not withdrawal. People sense this wholeness. They may not understand it intellectually, but they feel it instinctively. They feel steadier around you because your energy isn't scattered. They feel safer because you aren't projecting hidden insecurities or waiting for cues to know who to be. Your presence becomes a tuning fork that helps others find their own center. This is why those who are aligned with their truth attract opportunities that seem to fall into place. They aren't chasing outcomes. They're broadcasting clarity. They aren't wrestling with their shadows. They've integrated them. They aren't hustling for visibility. They're simply not hiding. The world is naturally drawn to what is whole, to what is genuine, to what is unburdened by pretense. Authentic presence carries a magnetic pull precisely because it is so rare. Most people operate from fragmentation, constantly shifting masks to meet external expectations. In contrast, someone who has stopped fragmenting radiates an unmistakable stability. This is where synchronicity becomes visible. Jung describes synchronicity as the alignment between inner order and outer circumstance. When your inner landscape is chaotic, life mirrors that chaos. When your inner landscape is cohesive, life begins to reflect that cohesion. You find yourself in the right conversations without forcing anything. You encounter people who see and value you without strategizing. You move through challenges without collapsing into the old pattern of self-betrayal. Instead of reacting to life, you respond from your center. Conditions don't control you. They reveal you. Once you reach this state, your energy carries a refinement that cannot be faked. You no longer need to announce your strength because it lives in your presence. You no longer need to defend your boundaries because they are woven into your way of being. You no longer cling to relationships or roles that shrink you. Your direction becomes guided from within, rather than dictated from fear. And through this inward orientation, you cultivate a way of living that is graceful, grounded, and unmistakably powerful. When you reach this depth of self-recognition, you discover something surprising. The world responds to you not because you demand it to, but because you have become aligned with your own truth. This alignment is what makes you magnetic. It's what makes your presence transformative. And it is what turns your life into a field of resonance rather than resistance. This is why certain people move through the world with a quiet power that shifts the atmosphere the moment they enter a room. They aren't forcing anything. They aren't seeking validation. They aren't calculating how to be perceived. Their presence is cohesive because their inner world is cohesive. They have integrated the parts of themselves they once pushed away, and as a result, they no longer leak energy through internal conflict. Jung understood this as the outcome of individuation, the merging of the conscious and unconscious so that a person becomes aligned rather than divided. When someone has done this inner work, they stop attracting chaos because chaos is no longer alive within them. They stop drawing in people who prey on uncertainty because they no longer broadcast uncertainty. Their interactions unfold from clarity, not fear. What others might interpret as confidence is really coherence, the natural steadiness that emerges when you're no longer fighting your own nature. And this inner coherence acts like a magnet, pulling toward you the people and situations that resonate with your depth while naturally repelling everything that can't engage with you from an authentic place. At this point, the attraction shifts from need-based to resonance-based. You don't attract through longing, insecurity, or old wounds demanding to be reenacted. You attract through alignment. The outer world mirrors your inner state with surprising precision. Opportunities feel organic rather than forced. Healthy relationships begin to appear because you've stopped entertaining dynamics that echo past imbalances. You gravitate toward environments where your wholeness is recognized, and you quietly withdraw from spaces that once demanded your self-abandonment. This shift isn't about becoming untouchable or invulnerable. It's about recognizing that vulnerability rooted in truth is stronger than any performance of toughness. You become transparent in the sense that you're not hiding, but grounded in the sense that you're not swayed by every breeze of opinion. People sense this right away. They sense that you're not scanning the room for cues, not shaping yourself around expectations, not negotiating your worth. Your presence stabilizes them because it stabilizes you. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of the self as the organizing principle of the psyche. When you are anchored in the self, you're not imprisoned by guilt or inflated by praise. You hear both without being defined by either. You respond to life from a place of deep internal orientation, and this orientation becomes visible to others. They may not articulate it, but they feel it, they trust it, they soften around it. And for those who cannot meet your truth, the distance grows naturally without conflict because your inner clarity makes mismatches obvious. As this deepening continues, you stop wasting energy on battles that never belong to you. You stop trying to rescue people from lessons they must learn on their own. You stop performing emotional labor to maintain connections built on imbalance. You no longer confuse love with self-sacrifice or strength with suppression. You reclaim the energy you once spent managing other people's comfort and reinvest it into your own alignment. This reclamation of energy is transformative. You feel more available to your own life, more receptive to intuition, more connected to purpose. You begin recognizing subtle invitations from the world that you missed before because you were preoccupied with proving yourself. Life becomes less about striving and more about responding, less about forcing outcomes and more about following inner direction. This is not passivity, it is precision. From here, your presence becomes a form of guidance, not through advice, but through embodiment. You become someone whose very way of being reminds others of what they are capable of remembering within themselves. You're not telling anyone what to do. Your existence simply reflects what alignment looks like, and alignment is contagious. It awakens what is dormant in others, not by instruction, but by resonance. This is the quiet influence of someone who has integrated their shadows and reclaimed their power. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is the natural authority of someone who has returned to their own center and refuses to leave it. There comes a moment when the inner shift becomes undeniable. You start noticing the exact second you slip into self-doubt, the instant you shrink your voice, the moment you brace for judgment that never arrives. These moments become signals rather than habits. You begin to recognize the old patterns not as truths, but as echoes of a past that no longer belongs to you. And in that recognition, an opening appears, a chance to choose differently. You pause, you breathe, you ask yourself a new kind of question. What if I didn't collapse here? What if I didn't apologize for existing? What if I allowed myself to simply be present without justification? That single interruption in the old script weakens its grip. Each time you interrupt it, your internal center strengthens. You stop viewing yourself as someone needing permission to take up space and start seeing yourself as someone whose presence is valid without negotiation. This shift changes how you act, but more importantly, it changes the energy from which you act. You speak more calmly, not because you're trying to appear confident, but because you're no longer arguing with yourself internally. Your decisions become cleaner, because you're no longer filtering them through layers of fear. Your boundaries become more natural, no longer forced or defended, but simply expressed as extensions of your truth. Others sense this clarity immediately. They feel the weight of your presence, not as heaviness but as groundedness. They respond to you differently, not because you ask for it, but because your inner posture no longer invites disrespect. The people who were once drawn to your uncertainty find no foothold. The ones who value honesty, depth, and sovereignty recognize you as someone operating on their frequency. You become a point of orientation, a subtle but steady source of coherence in a world filled with noise. As this inner foundation stabilizes, something else unfolds. Life starts meeting you at this new level. Opportunities arise that feel aligned rather than arbitrary. Conversations become richer. Relationships become more reciprocal. You start noticing synchronicities, moments where your internal clarity mirrors itself in external events. Jung saw this as the psyche and the world entering into an unspoken dialogue. You think from center, and the world responds from center. This doesn't mean your life becomes free of challenge. It means the nature of the challenge changes. You're no longer fighting old battles born from self-neglect. You're engaging with new terrain that calls for creativity, intuition, and authentic presence. Difficulty no longer destabilizes you because you're no longer depending on external conditions to determine your worth. You carry your center with you. This inner steadiness grows into a kind of quiet radiance. Not performance, not grandeur, just truth made visible. You stop trying to be impressive and become unmistakably real. And this realness is what resonates. It invites depth. It dissolves pretense. It attracts those who are ready to meet you where you truly are. Those who cannot simply fade from your orbit without conflict, without resentment. They sense the shift, even if they cannot name it. You stop chasing. You stop shrinking. You stop contorting yourself into someone else's expectations. You begin to see how much energy you once spent managing your own disappearance. And as you reclaim that energy, you feel more awake, more whole, more capable of meeting life as it is, rather than through the lens of old wounds. This is the quietly powerful state Jung saw as sovereignty, a psychological adulthood defined not by dominance, but by inner coherence. You move with intention. You speak with clarity. You choose with awareness. You relate without losing yourself. And the world responds as if recognizing someone who has finally come home to themselves. You attract from truth now, not fear, from fullness, not lack, from presence, not performance. And everything in your life begins to reorder itself to match this new inner structure. There comes a moment when the inner shift becomes undeniable. You start noticing the exact second you slip into self-doubt, the instant you shrink your voice, the moment you brace for judgment that never arrives. These moments become signals rather than habits. You begin to recognize the old patterns not as truths, but as echoes of a past that no longer belongs to you. And in that recognition, an opening appears, a chance to choose differently. You pause, you breathe, you ask yourself a new kind of question. What if I didn't collapse here? What if I didn't apologize for existing? What if I allowed myself to simply be present without justification? That single interruption in the old script weakens its grip. Each time you interrupt it, your internal center strengthens. You stop viewing yourself as someone needing permission to take up space and start seeing yourself as someone whose presence is valid without negotiation. This shift changes how you act, but more importantly, it changes the energy from which you act. You speak more calmly, not because we're trying to appear confident, but because you're no longer arguing with yourself internally. Your decisions become cleaner, because you're no longer filtering them through layers of fear. Your boundaries become more natural, no longer forced or defended, but simply expressed as extensions of your truth. Others sense this clarity immediately. They feel the weight of your presence, not as heaviness, but as groundedness. They respond to you differently, not because you ask for it, but because your inner posture no longer invites disrespect. The people who were once drawn to your uncertainty find no foothold. The ones who value honesty, depth, and sovereignty recognize you as someone operating on their frequency. You become a point of orientation, a subtle but steady source of coherence in a world filled with noise. As this inner foundation stabilizes, something else unfolds. Life starts meeting you at this new level. Opportunities arise that feel aligned rather than arbitrary. Conversations become richer. Relationships become more reciprocal. You start noticing synchronicities, moments where your internal clarity mirrors itself in external events. Jung saw this as the psyche and the world entering into an unspoken dialogue. You think from center, and the world responds from center. This doesn't mean your life becomes free of challenge. It means the nature of the challenge changes. You're no longer fighting old battles born from self-neglect. You're engaging with new terrain that calls for creativity, intuition, and authentic presence. Difficulty no longer destabilizes you because you're no longer depending on external conditions to determine your worth. You carry your center with you. This inner steadiness grows into a kind of quiet radiance. Not performance, not grandeur, just truth made visible. You stop trying to be impressive and become unmistakably real. And this realness is what resonates. It invites depth. It dissolves pretense. It attracts those who are ready to meet you where you truly are. Those who cannot simply fade from your orbit without conflict, without resentment. They sense the shift, even if they cannot name it. You stop chasing. You stop shrinking. You stop contorting yourself into someone else's expectations. You begin to see how much energy you once spent managing your own disappearance. And as you reclaim that energy, you feel more awake, more whole, more capable of meeting life as it is, rather than through the lens of old wounds. This is the quietly powerful state Jung saw as sovereignty, a psychological adulthood defined not by dominance but by inner coherence. You move with intention, you speak with clarity, you choose with awareness, you relate without losing yourself, and the world responds as if recognizing someone who has finally come home to themselves. You attract from truth now, not fear, from fullness, not lack, from presence, not performance, and everything in your life begins to reorder itself to match this new inner structure.